other things have changed because of the virus, and that is we're not sure how we're going to do our summer tours yet, but we'll work on it. Usually June, July, and August, sometimes September, rather than having formal presentations, we go on tour, and we have a lot of fun seeing members' gardens or going to other native plant sites. WOW is our newest program that we developed, and it's basically going for a walk with other Wild Ones friends, and that's on hiatus as well, but we will try to get that going. Maybe we can go for socially distant walks. And our service projects, we're trying to figure out how to make those work this summer. We have a project at a local elementary school, a local library. We also work in Como Park Woodland. And for all of these, please check our website, look for emails, sign up for emails, Facebook and Instagram, other places to find out what's going on. So this is what you mentioned. The book that Barb mentioned that she had been able to obtain at our conference in February. I have copies, and I'd be happy to send them to you. Just send me an email at president@bigriverbigwoods.org. If you can donate something to our cause, since we're not having a plant sale this spring, that would be great. But if not, that's fine too. You can just send me an email with a day and time that you'd like to pick it up. I live in Shoreview, and I'm about a mile from our meeting site where we usually meet. So if that helps you, or I can mail it to you, just whatever works. So president@bigriverbigwoods.org. Next month, we plan to also meet by Zoom, and this meeting will be about native shrubs and trees. And Eric Olson is one of our favorite speakers. He was our first speaker when our chapter started 5 years ago. And come with questions, because he's really got great answers and is a lot of fun as a speaker. So keep in mind, May 28th, we'll send out an email again. And I think that's just about it for my announcements. Tonight's speaker, I hope you had a chance to read a little bit about what Caitlin will be talking about. And she is our first Zoom speaker, so we're very excited that she could be here with us tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Stop sharing, there.
And you gave me just enough time to change the title on my slide to match the title that I gave you. So well done. And let me see, I'm not going to make the same mistake as you, even though I was just starting to click the play screen without clicking my share screen first. All right. Giving presentations via Zoom is always a bit of an interesting experience because you don't get any of the audience feedback. You feel like you're just talking into space, which I feel like I've been doing a lot of lately as I record PowerPoints for students. So there'll be time at the end, certainly, to ask questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Now that my screen is shared, I can't see if anyone is typing questions in the chat. So if you're asking a question, I'm not trying to ignore you. If it is a point of clarification, Joe or Eva or someone else can interrupt and let me know so that I don't skip ahead too fast. As you heard, my name's Caitlin. I am the Education and Community Engagement Coordinator at Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve. I'll tell you a bit about Cedar Creek today, particularly in light of our biodiversity research, which is featured. One of our many biodiversity experiments, but the one that kind of is our most famous is featured here on this title slide. So I always like to start when I talk about biodiversity and when I talk about Cedar Creek in general with a very large scale view. So here's a global map of the biomes of the world. And as I'm sure many of you know, 3 of North America's largest biomes are found here in Minnesota. And in fact, all 3 can be found at Cedar Creek. We're located at what is called an ecological triple point. So a place where those three biomes can exist simultaneously in space and in time due to the combination of temperature and precipitation that our particular site gets. We're about 40 minutes north of the Twin Cities in East Bethel, Minnesota. I think you can see my cursor, is that true? Okay, yes. we sit at the intersection of three local watersheds. So all of our water obviously drains to the Mississippi, but some of it comes via the St. Croix, some of it goes via a mini watershed called Crooked Brook, eventually into the Rum, and some of it goes from the Cedar Creek into the Rum before dumping into the Mississippi. So we're at this intersection, hydrologically speaking, as well as ecologically speaking. Half of our property, as you can also see on the same map, half of our property is technically in greater Minnesota in Isanti County, and half of our property is in Anoka County in the metro. So there's some interesting boundaries in terms of enforcement and regulations, as well as in terms of urban development. Cedar Creek, when you zoom in even further into this map here at the bottom, is about 5,500 acres of landscape owned by the University of Minnesota. Because we sit at this triple point, we are home naturally to a huge amount of diversity. This is a little map, a color-coded, color by number sort of map showing the native plant diversity that's found on site. All of those plants make it possible for us to have an incredible amount of animal diversity as well, including well over half of the mammal and bird species found in the state of Minnesota, an incredible array of insects, several reptiles of special concern as well. So all of this natural diversity is a lot of the reason that Cedar Creek exists as it is. So we are first and foremost a place that's set aside for science and set aside for scientific research. We've been doing scientific research at our facility in East Bethel officially since 1942, unofficially since the 1930s, as I'll show you in a moment. Increasingly, especially in this time of social distancing, we are becoming a place that people can go to connect with nature. We do maintain, you can see a picture of it here in the middle of the screen, a public nature trail on the southeast side of our property that is open during the pandemic for people to take socially distant walks and enjoy some of the plant and animal diversity that calls Cedar Creek home. A big part of my job is the last of these 4 points, that Cedar Creek is a place for education. My role, although my background is as an academic scientist and a field biologist, my role at Cedar Creek really is to connect people, whether they're kids like the ones in these pictures or adults like you all, to the work that goes on site, to the diversity that's present on site, and into kind of a scientifically literate ethos so that we can move forward into the world together as a community, making good decisions for our environment. Our overarching mission at Cedar Creek is to find sustainable solutions to environmental challenges through a combination of research, conservation, education, and community engagement. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, systemic biodiversity loss is probably the biggest, most pervasive, most widespread, in many cases, hardest to address environmental challenge that we face as a world today. So when Eric asked me to give a talk and we were talking about topics, biodiversity seemed like a natural one. It's an area that is of great interest to Cedar Creek from a research perspective, of great interest to groups like yours from an action perspective, and should be something that we all care about and are working to learn more about as a community. So my plan for this talk is to kind of take our mission statement and break it down into the different areas that Cedar Creek focuses on biodiversity, and kind of walk you through some of the research, some of the conservation, and some of the education and community engagement work that we do, specifically as it relates to biodiversity and biodiversity loss. So if you go back to the very beginning of Cedar Creek, and if any of you took a college level biology class at any time since the 1950s, you might have seen this particular diagram. Since the 1940s, really, we've been a site that's famous for kind of looking at ecosystems in a holistic sense. This figure here is from Ray Lindemann's seminal 1942 paper on what he called the trophic dynamic aspect of ecology. Essentially, Ray was the first scientist in the world to take an entire ecosystem, try and map out all of its parts and the interactions within its parts, and then to show how energy moved from the sun to plants to consumers all the way up a food chain. And in doing this work through this diagram, he determined one of the very few fundamental rules in ecology, which is called Lindemann's 10% rule. The idea that as you move up a food chain, only 10% of the available energy gets converted into tissue at the next level. He was also, in many respects, one of the first folks to really start looking at diversity. He was very interested in the things that lived in this one particular lake at Cedar Creek. And I took the liberty of scanning this amazing fold-out figure from his 1941 thesis that shows the population dynamics of the things that are in the lake as they changed over time. So everything from the predators on down to the pond weed. And this sort of approach of looking at a diverse community and sampling all aspects of that diversity was pretty revolutionary in the 1930s and early 40s when he was doing his work. So he kind of set the stage for a lot of what we do now at Cedar Creek. In the 1960s, Cedar Creek was home to another kind of groundbreaking set of research. Scientists working on site developed radio telemetry. So the idea that you could track animals across space and time without actually physically watching them. This is something that many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with now. If you yourself are a nature documentary watcher or you have kids or grandkids, this is the technology that is now in like animal collars that are deployed on species all over the world. And this idea of telemetry started to let us expand how we looked at diversity, not just the many different kinds of species present on the landscape, but the ways that they had diverse behaviors, diverse strategies for making their way through the world, diverse and individual choices. In the 1960s, Cedar Creek started what's now one of the longest continuously running experiments on fire in the world. We burn about 900 acres of our landscape each year as part of research into oak savanna and prairie restoration. So a lot of the work that has been done at Cedar Creek and continues to be done at Cedar Creek looks at what happens particularly to plant communities under different fire regimes. And this allows us to kind of burn in a way that maximizes floral diversity in a lot of these systems. I love this picture. I found it when I was looking for something else a few weeks ago. It's got a beautiful downed tree that has been through a fire, and you can see some of the range of plants that come back in our oak savannas after a spring burn. By the 1980s, the federal government and scientists around the world were starting to realize that many of the global challenges that we face are not happening in 1 and 2 year chunks, the way that scientific funding often happens. That things like climate change, things like biodiversity loss are problems that take place and whose impacts accumulate over many, many years. And so as a scientific community, we need to be setting up experiments that run for many, many years. What you can learn in a 1 or 2 year regular funding sort of experiment often doesn't actually apply to the real world. So in the 1980s, the National Science Foundation set up a long-term ecological research network, of which Cedar Creek was one of the original 11 sites. And this is a network that continues to run through the present day and prioritizes these long-term experiments. And under that funding package, we're able to really start digging into questions about biodiversity and questions about the role of biodiversity in community functioning. This experiment that's up here now on the screen is perhaps our most famous experiment. This is Dr. Dave Tillman's big biodiversity research area. For a sense of scale, you can see these little white cars over on the side. We've got, looks like a Suburban, maybe some sort of a large SUV, and then a slightly smaller vehicle. But this is truly an enormous field. Covers about 25 acres. There are 342 of these little squares. Each one is 9 meters on a side. And as you can tell from just a quick glance from this helicopter view, they're planted with different diversity configurations. So we have some bare ground plots. Whoops, let me go back. These plots that are weeded back down to mineral soil several times during the summer that give us a chance to see kind of things about the soil profile, water infiltration, evaporation rates, carbon flux in the absence of plants. Then you have some plots that are planted with only a single species and look very homogeneous. You have others that are planted with 2 species, 4, 8, 16, or 32. Primarily prairie plants, although you can see in a few plots, there's some woody species as well. There's some oaks in a couple of those plots. But by and large, the experiment now focuses on prairie plant diversity. And you can tell from a quick glance as well that some of these plots are doing really well, have a lot of healthy plants, a lot of cover, not a ton of bare ground showing for evaporation to speed up. You can see other plots like this one over here or this one up here that maybe look a little patchier. There's one right here that also looks fairly patchy. So you can see that under these different diversity plantings, you see pretty different results. This experiment was set up because in the 1980s, the reigning kind of scientific theory was that biodiversity was nice for human aesthetics, but didn't really impact plant community functioning. So we enjoy biodiverse landscapes because we like variety. We like not having to look at the same thing all the time. But if you're a plant, the mathematical models said you didn't want to be competing with a bunch of things that were unrelated to you, were from completely different species, that were stealing your nutrients. You wanted to be kind of surrounded by friends. Turns out that math is not right. This experiment was set up to test that theory, and it showed pretty definitively that diversity is hugely important for plant communities. The high diversity plots in this experiment produce significantly more biomass annually, so they add more plant tissue every year than their monoculture counterparts. They're more stable as a community, so they're better able to weather things like unexpected droughts or unexpected floods or insect invasions or any other kind of environmental disturbance you throw at them. They have more complex root structures and produce significantly more biomass underground. Disease moves through them less quickly, and they experience less, especially fungal diseases overall. They sequester more carbon in the soil. They host a greater variety and a greater number of insects, both beneficial to the plant insects and harmful to the plant insects, but they support this incredible other set of life. They have really different ways of using water and nutrients and of changing the way that water and nutrients cycle through their community. And we're finding as well that that's got a typo in it, but they're harder for exotic species to invade. So in this field, some of these plots are weeded every year back to their original planted species. Some of them are left unweeded and used as a place to look at how invasions happen. And what we find is that it's really hard to invade a highly diverse native plot. It's quite easy for invasive species to get into those low diversity plots, but pretty hard in those high, especially the 8 and 16 species plots. This experiment still runs today, although it's looking a little bit different this year. As you can imagine, weeding all of those plots multiple times during the summer back to their original planting configurations takes a lot of people working in fairly close proximity. So we're sorting out how exactly this is going to work this year. But the experiment continues to run. It's highly productive. There have been over 100 peer-reviewed papers that have been written in the last 26 years about this experiment. it's provided this incredible kind of foundation for other work to happen. So layered on top of those diversity treatments are additional treatments that manipulate water, manipulate fertilizer, manipulate temperature, start to kind of look at biodiversity in the context of some of these other global change variables. And because the experiment has produced such robust and repeatable results, scientists on the whole now believe that biodiversity matters, that conserving biodiversity matters, that restoring biodiversity at a global scale matters, and that we really need to take action not just for our own aesthetics, but for the sake of the plants as well. Another long-term experiment that's actually just right next door in the field to the big biodiversity experiment we just looked at is one called BioCon. This is an experiment that has biodiversity as one of its manipulated variables, but also looks at the role of carbon dioxide and nitrogen in plant community functioning. So this is run by Dr. Peter Reich and Dr. Sarah Hobby, who are pictured very pixelated down at the bottom of the screen. This experiment has 6 rings that are set up. Inside those rings are 64 mini plots. They're only about 2 meters on a side. And as you can see, diversity is manipulated within those plots as well. And then a subset of the plots have nitrogen added, a different subset have rain removed, a different subset have heat added, and then 3 of these 6 rings have carbon dioxide added. So this experiment is really important because it manipulates a lot of things that we know are changing simultaneously in the real world and are probably interacting in a highly kind of controllable setting. So for example, we make sure that the carbon dioxide in these plots is kept at 180 parts per million above ambient. And what ambient was when this experiment started in 1997 is not the same as what it is now, but the amount above ambient has stayed the same. So we're able to put in some really tight controls that allow us in a lot of respects to kind of look into the future using our scientist crystal ball and try and understand how a lot of these variables interact. This experiment has some pretty important results from the perspective of biodiversity. We found in this experiment that highly diverse plots are not only produce more biomass. So on this, this graph, these black bars are the 16 species plots, our most diverse plots. And you can see, regardless of the treatment, that black bar is always higher than the hashed and open bars next to it. So high diversity plots always produce more biomass, but perhaps most importantly, they're able to help their community as a whole take advantage of the additions that we are making as humans to environments. So high diversity plots not only grow more, but grow significantly more than their low diversity counterparts under a high CO2 situation. So in areas worldwide where CO2 is going up, those high diversity plots are able to really efficiently capture that excess carbon and use it to grow more tissue. Same with nitrogen. Humans are adding an incredible amount of free nitrogen to the environment. And what we're finding is that those high diversity plots are able to really efficiently capture and use it. You see that also in what is perhaps the most true to life real world experiment, which is a combination of both elevated CO2 and elevated nitrogen. So when carbon dioxide is high and nitrogen is high, those high diversity plots really put it to good use. By contrast, you can look at these monocultures and you can see that they grow a little bit more when there's extra CO2. They grow a little bit more when there's extra nitrogen, but it's nothing like the high diversity plots. This is important because, especially from a CO2 perspective, plants are often looked at as this incredible helpful sponge, taking up about 25% of the carbon dioxide emissions that we as humans put out into the atmosphere. What BioCon has showed us is that if all of our plants are growing in monoculture, like so much of the agricultural landscapes around the world, they're not actually doing that great a job of sucking up our extra CO2. If we instead prioritize having some high diversity landscapes out there, they can really do that job of being the sponge for us. This ends up going both ways, which is kind of interesting. So this plot is looking at what happens when you fertilize. This is another figure from the Biocon experiment. And as you gardeners probably know, when you add too much fertilizer, you often lose diversity. The difference between the gray bars and the white bars in each of these pairs is the result of fertilization. So if we start with 10 species on average in a plot and we add a bunch of fertilizer, we end up losing a couple of species. They get outcompeted by things that can grow really fast under these high nitrogen scenarios. When we have high diversity, or when we have elevated CO2 conditions, we don't lose as much diversity. So this is kind of a confusing result, especially because in the last figure, we saw that both CO2 and nitrogen cause plants to grow more. One of those also causes some plants to grow so much that they knock out their neighbors. And having high CO2, which we know is happening right now, can help some of that diversity stay and kind of keep being diverse in the face of high nitrogen, which we know is also happening. So it's good to start with high biodiversity, and that biodiversity can be retained by some of the problems that we're causing in the world, which is surprising and wouldn't have been found if this wasn't a long-term experiment. We've got new experiments going in as well that focus on different aspects of diversity. So this is an experiment that started being planted in 2016. It is all in now. It's called the Forests and Biodiversity Experiment. This takes some of the lessons learned in Dave Tillman's prairie plant experiment on diversity and moves it to a forest system. So we've planted 40,000 trees in different diversity configurations. These flags represent different species. So they flagged out the whole field, and then these poor interns had to go and put the right tree next to the right flag. And you can see, for example, here is a monoculture of red flags. Well, over here in the back is a high diversity little plot of trees. This experiment looks at many different aspects of diversity. So in all the experiments that I've talked about so far, mostly what we care about is number of species growing together and not too much about their identity. So a 4-species plot might have 4 different kinds of grasses that are all different species, or it might have 2 grasses, a legume, and a forb. Obviously, from a gardening perspective, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that functionally those are very different plots. Having a garden bed that has a couple of native grass species, a lupin, and a lead plant is going to be pretty different than just having big blue stem, little blue stem, and a couple of other grasses. So when we move into this forestry experiment, we manipulate not just that species number, but also species identity. So we look at functional diversity, kind of how the plants make their living. We look at phylogenetic diversity, how closely related those plants are in terms of evolutionary history, and we look at number of species. In some of the monocultures, we also look at very fine scale genetic diversity. So we have monocultures of red oaks where all of the seedlings that were planted were sprouted from acorns that came from the same mother tree, and other monocultures are planted with seedlings that were sprouted from acorns that came from all different mother trees. So they're monocultures from a species perspective, but maybe there's something there in their own genetics that plays into growth rates, disease transmission, competition, nutrient use. We'll also be looking in this experiment at soil, at food webs, at kind of all aspects from the individual tree on up to the community. If you've been to Cedar Creek in the last few years, you know that we also have a new experiment that brings bison to our oak savanna areas. This experiment started in 2018, and it looks at kind of how adding a mega herbivore like a bison back to a landscape like an oak savanna impacts ecosystem dynamics and floral diversity. We are planning on having the bison back this summer. They're due to arrive sometime in late May. We don't know yet if there will be public access, but they are an essential treatment of a long-term experiment, so they themselves are coming back. We also have another experiment that looks at animal diversity in light of a recent natural recolonization event by wolves. So wolves showed up at Cedar Creek in 2015. We're trying to figure out how the presence of a top predator on the landscape shifts the behavior and abundance of all the animals that are below it in the food chain, and then how those animal shifts play out into shifts in plant health, plant growth, and plant diversity. And it's going to be really cool. There's not a lot of wolves up in our area. We don't have a breeding pack at the moment. We just have one or two that wander through every now and again. But they are having significant shifts on the other animals. And then we think from there, ultimately, we'll see some of the trophic cascade play out in the plants and in the soils. Even more brand new, this experiment just went in about 3.5 weeks ago. An experiment called Rescue, the Rescuing Ecosystems and Species Currently Undergoing Extinction, is a new long-term experiment that aims to test some different restoration strategies. So we have some large plots that have had, I think it's like 0, 5, 50, and 99% of their native plant cover removed. To mimic different kind of levels of human impacts on ecosystems. And then some of them are being reseeded. Some of them are being heavily reseeded, some are being less heavily reseeded, some we're letting naturally reseed themselves from what blows in from the neighboring landscape. And hopefully we'll be able to find out kind of what are some useful biodiversity restoration strategies. What works well, particularly in these kind of prairie environments, and how those strategies might need to be tuned to different human impact scenarios. A really neat thing about having all of this work take place at Cedar Creek is that we're able to pool the results from many, many experiments and try and figure out what is the most important of all the manipulations that we do. And this is one of my favorite figures that's come out of Cedar Creek. This is from a meta-analysis of 11 long-term experiments. And what you see here, this blue bar, is the important part. What this blue bar tells you is that the loss of biodiversity, the change from a 16 species plot to a 1 species plot, has a greater impact on productivity, so how much stuff is growing, than literally anything else. So it has more of an effect than adding a bunch of nitrogen, more of an effect than adding water or removing water or adding carbon dioxide or removing an herbivore or burning. The thing that matters most, at least from a plant biomass and plant productivity perspective, is diversity. And that is the thing that we are losing more quickly than anything else worldwide. This is a great quote from the paper. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but the slideshow is being recorded, so you can go back and read it on your own time. The last of these 3 paragraphs, though, I think is pretty impactful. Our results suggest that the loss of biodiversity may have at least as great an impact on ecosystem functioning as other anthropogenic drivers of environmental change, and that the use of diverse mixtures of species may be as effective in increasing productivity as fertilization, and may simultaneously provide better ecosystem services. So understanding how biodiversity impacts plant communities gives us a chance to make some really good decisions when it comes to restoration, when it comes to taking action in our own yards, in our own parks, into the service projects that we choose to engage in. biodiversity matters. Biodiversity matters more than pretty much anything else out there. And in some respects, it is a lot easier to take action on than trying to add back in an herbivore that's been eliminated from your landscape, or add back in fire in a highly developed urban landscape. Being told that the thing you can do that matters is to do what you as gardeners are doing, plant a diverse range of native species, hopefully is something that makes you feel proud of the work that you're already doing. We've touched on a lot of our conservation issues and initiatives already, so I just have 2 slides about that. These are our oak savannas. They are stunning. I did most of my field work for my own PhD in East Africa, and when I see these aerial pictures of Cedar Creek's oak savannas, they make me feel like I'm in East Africa. There are these incredible mosaic landscapes with an incredible amount of diversity. I know that many Wild Ones members have come up and gone for guided tours and programs in the oak savannas, and once we restart them, I hope you all will come up again, because they're incredible systems with a lot of really cool things going on in them, including red-headed woodpeckers. So a lot of our conservation initiatives focus on these rare ecosystems that support rare species. The woodpeckers are really easy to see, very dramatic, very fun to watch. This wolf pup is not easy to see, but is very cute, and hopefully there will be more of them at some point in the future at Cedar Creek. But we do care about kind of understanding how to conserve and restore the biodiversity that exists in our area. We also have a number of education and community engagement initiatives that tie directly into our biodiversity research. A wide, diverse array of them, in fact. So this is where I spend most of my time, developing and leading programs for kids as well as for adults. We do things like you all, with our local library system, with the university, with some of our local groups that care about the same sorts of environmental issues that we do. One of the things that kind of features prominently in a lot of our education programs is the chance to walk through Minnesota's diversity. One of my projects during quarantine has been trying to make the walk that we normally invite people to come on during their programs something that is digital and can be done from the safety of your own home. So there's some URLs down on the bottom for the walk out to Cedar Bog Lake, where Ray Lindemann did that research on ecosystems back in the 1930s. I have a spring one and a summer one up right now, and I'm working on finishing fall and winter. But this is a great chance, especially if you're new to Minnesota or you're a kid that hasn't had a chance to go outside of the cities, to really see what we mean when we say Minnesota is an incredibly diverse state. A lot of our kids also get to go out and visit these experiments that we've been learning about, do activities that use their data, explore and really get a firsthand sense of what biodiversity is and why it's important. They then get a chance to do their own investigations, many of which tie in directly to native plants, to native animals, to some of the questions that are being researched by our scientists. This extends into our undergrad and graduate learning communities, into programs for master gardeners and master naturalists, for talks like this one to community groups. And then we try and give people a chance not just to sit around and listen to me go on and on like you all are so patiently doing, but also to get out on the landscape and really get to know the science, know the species, practice your plant ID, learn how to watch for birds or catch moths. Usually, especially this time of year, we have a whole suite of programs for folks to engage with, not so much right now, but in the future we will again. This includes a couple of citizen science initiatives that are directly tied to biodiversity. One is a quarterly wildlife tracking survey. So if your interests extend beyond plants to animals, we invite you to come out and help us figure out exactly which of the diverse Minnesotan animal species are present on the landscape at any given time. You can also join in and do that same sort of stuff from home. We have trail cameras that capture a lot of pictures of animals and also a lot of pictures of plants. People always ask me which plants are in the pictures that are just of blowing plants, and I never know. So you can come be the plant expert on our Eyes on the Wild projects. And these are just a range of ways to connect with us. But the most important thing is that diversity is hugely important to plants, to community functioning, to the animals that rely on those plants, to the insects that rely on those plants, and that preserving diversity is probably the most important thing that we can do. So keep up the great work. Please come out and visit us. I was saying at the beginning when I joined this call that I haven't been at Cedar Creek since March 16th. So I can't invite you anytime soon because I don't know when I will get to go back. But once we're open for business again, I hope you all will come out and visit. It's a beautiful place and it's filled with plant people. So come and be one of them. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen at this point. I'm sure there are questions and I'm happy to do my best to answer them or whatever else is next on the agenda. Oh, I see a couple questions already. Joe, you want to know the most surprising finding of which particular experiment?
The first one that you showed us.
Yes, the big biodiversity experiment, the one that that is truly huge. I think the most surprising thing is how long it took for the highly diverse plots to consistently outperform the monocultures. So for the first 11 years of that experiment, every year there was one monoculture that had super high productivity. Which monoculture that was varied hugely from year to year. If it was a wet year, there'd be one species that did super well and grew like crazy. In a dry year, it would be something else entirely, but it took more than a decade for the impact of a diverse ecosystem to accumulate enough that community was consistently growing more than the best performing monoculture. So there was always one plot that tried to prove the math right, even when all the other plots were doing what they do in the real world. So that experiment, I think, has really highlighted the value of these long-term research experiments and of the fact that a lot of the things that happen in the world and the dynamics that we see in the world happen because they've been running a natural experiment for a really long time. So that's been very surprising, I think, to many of us. Gail wanted to know, how do you add carbon dioxide to a plot? So the Biocon experiment is something that's called a free air carbon enrichment experiment, or FACE. There are PVC pipes, essentially, that surround that circle. They're each linked to a little sensor that measures wind speed and direction and has a one-way valve that's controlled by a computer. And every 4 seconds, a wind speed and direction measure is taken. And depending on where the wind is coming from and how strongly it's blowing, some of the little one-way valves open and gaseous CO2 comes from a pump house out into these pieces of PVC pipe and blows across the plot. It's a pretty remarkable system, given that it was set up in 1997 and has been running continuously ever since, using 1997 technology and engineering and computing. We are hoping to do a little bit of upgrading, hopefully this year, but we will see. Let's see. Peg, shoot me an email. Caitlin, C-A-I-T-L-I-N @UM, is a teacher and is interested in either classroom resources or coming out on a field trip or having Cedar Creek in their classroom to do a program. Please email me. We serve about 7,000 kids a year right now and are always happy to expand. All right, let's see. Kathy and Paul. Can I just say my parents' names are Kathy and Paul, and it makes me really happy to know that there's another Kathy and Paul on this call. Kathy and Paul are going to be doing BioBlitz stuff. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's just Kathy is doing that, so it's just a generic.
That also sounds a lot like my family.
He just will, he's not going to be out there.
Yeah, this weekend is the City Nature Challenge.
Yeah.
Cedar Creek usually participates. We're not this year because we don't have a lot of public access. But you're wondering about important things to keep in mind in terms of what? In terms of like where to go or what to document?
Well, I live on the east side of St. Paul, and there's what I call neglected natural areas that I pull out trash, and there's homeless people, and try to save it from, you know, putting in a highway and things like that, and count birds and look for, you know, all the bumblebees. And so there's rusty patches here. So it's just, you know, the city thing that gradually in a complex way, nature goes away, but it's not gone yet. And so I see all these cool plants, you know, I thought, oh, it's in the degraded woods, you know, but it's not. I mean, there's all kinds of diversity there with the garlic mustard, the trash, and the buckthorn. So I'm going to participate in this. Never have done one before. I'm not a biologist. I'm newly retired, and so my avocation has become my vocation.
Awesome.
So I'm having a good time. But I've just never done it before, and you guys are doing, you know, biodiversity and would be the people using this data. And so I mean, I'll just keep picking up trash and take pictures of everything I see, or should I include my yard and my neighbors' yards?
Yeah, so the idea with the City Nature Challenge is to broadly document everything that can be found. It used to be in the 7-county metro area on this one particular weekend in April. I think they've expanded it this year so that more folks can participate. And the goal is really to get like a snapshot in time sort of thing. So anywhere you go and anything that you put on iNaturalist is going to be valuable toward that effort. In a long-term management perspective, I would say doing what you're doing, picking up the trash, removing invasives as you find them, and finding ways to kind of bring attention in your community to some of those places that could be restored, whether that's bringing things up at a city council meeting or coordinating with your local Wild Ones and Master Gardeners sort of chapters to do some service projects that focus on your local neighborhood resources potentially, I think would be good kind of long-term action items. It is a challenge, restoring urban settings when there's not a lot of people that care about that particular tiny pocket. Is well,
the people who live here do. It just, you know, there's so many things that go on in a city, and a lot of people lose touch. You know, it just takes one generation, and or you're new to this country and you don't know what a bumblebee is, or how to grow food. So, but yeah. Okay, I'll take a picture of that dead muskrat. So if you're saying everything, so.
Send me the picture of the dead muskrat. Okay, I love it when people send me pictures of dead things.
Yeah, what happened there? Anyway, thank you.
There's always a story. Elizabeth, you made it on. I'm so happy. Elizabeth was asking me if she could join the call, and I didn't know, so I directed her to Joe, and I'm happy that you're here, Elizabeth. Elizabeth wanted to know, how did Cedar Creek start? I mentioned the 30s and 40s as early dates. Why then, that sort of stuff. So Cedar Creek officially was chartered in 1942. So that's like our official by the books start date. Folks started being interested in the mid 30s, I think like 1934 or so. A geologist flew over the land that turned into Cedar Creek in a little biplane, and he looked down on Cedar Bog Lake. And in the fall, if you look from the sky at Cedar Bog Lake, you can see these beautiful concentric circles of open water, aquatic vegetation, swamp loosestrife, tamaracks, cedars, hardwoods. And when a scientist, well, when a plant person or a ecosystem ecologist looks at something like that, they immediately say there's an ecosystem undergoing succession, an ecosystem transitioning from something aquatic to something terrestrial. A geologist flying over and looking at that says, interesting, it looks like at some point something interesting geologically happened there, perhaps an ice block lake formed because there's just this isolated lake that's not really connected to other water sources. And so that geologist, William Skinner Cooper, wanted to come back and investigate that lake from a geology perspective. So he bushwhacked his way out there, befriended people that owned nearby acreage, started doing a little bit of science in the mid-30s. And then in a lot of the same ways, Kathy, that you were talking about community involvement, he got some community involvement. In fact, one of the early folks that really helped with forming the landscape of Cedar Creek was Martha Crone, who, if any of you are familiar with the Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden, was the second curator of that space. She owned a 40-acre parcel right next to Cedar Bog Lake and had a little cabin up there and used that landscape as one of the big collection sites for many of the native plants that ended up down at Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden. And she became friends with the scientists. She had a lot of connections down in the cities to academics, to rich people with money, as well as a lot of connections to the local farmers. And she set out on what amounted to a one-woman campaign, well, two women, I guess, between her and another woman named Cora Cornea, who also had land in the area. They spent a lot of time looking up foreclosure records at the auditor's office and figuring out which farms were about to go under and talking to neighbors who were likely to lose their land, and offered to buy that land before it got taken by the bank. And so we're able to amass probably about 90% of the land that Cedar Creek sits on today by the early 1940s. And then they sold it to the university. The U partnered with the Minnesota Academy of Sciences to write a charter to manage that land for scientific research and public education in perpetuity. So it's been protected since the 40s in such a way that the university cannot sell it, even if they want to. Anything that is touching the original acreage that was chartered in the 1940s is permanently and forever protected. Lindemann started working there before that charter happened. He published his thesis in 1941. He passed away in 1942, the same year that Cedar Creek was chartered. He was 27 years old. He had a congenital liver disease that ended up killing him. So his big famous paper was actually published after his death under the urging of his postdoc advisor. So his work was happening kind of right around the time that Cedar Creek was being formed. All right, Mark is wondering, does biodiversity in our yards mean moving away from areas with swaths of the same species to a mix of all selected species in the same area? It's a great question. What biodiversity means for your yard is going to be really dependent on your soil type, the amount of space that you have, and kind of the resources that you have to maintain it. Certainly having a mix of species, of native species that you know will thrive, will start giving you a lot of the same benefits that we see in our prairie plant experiments. Our seeds came from prairie restorations. They were bought just like from the regular storefront, the way that regular people can buy their seeds, and hand sown in 1993. So you could do something very similar with the exact same species. seems like the benefits are maximized when you have several functional groups. So when you have, for example, a mix of C3 and C4 grasses, flowering forbs, and legumes. But which species and kind of in what configuration is going to depend a lot on your particular yard. My yard is extremely sunny. I'm on the Anoka Sand Plain. There's not, the same species that do well in your yard are definitely not the same ones that do well here. And there's lots of people, I'd say, in Wild Ones and on this call who can probably give better advice than I can about what those mixes should be. I know that's one of the other questions, kind of how to choose the right plants if you're starting from scratch. Tilton was wondering that. So I will answer this one last question from Barb, and then I will let a plant person give some suggestions about planting biodiverse mixtures in your yards and how you pick your species. Barb is wondering, when Cedar Creek is open again, does the public need to be part of an organized tour to come up, or are there trails one can visit and birdwatch during open hours? I will put in the chat a link to our one open trail, which is that one over at Fish Lake. That is the only part of the property that is regularly and reliably open to the public. It is a trail that's about 3 miles in length. It goes along the lake shore through the Oak Savanna. It is a phenomenal place to bird watch. Great for warblers, great for sparrows, great for woodpeckers, waterfowl on the lakes. There's always a breeding pair of loons. There's swans up there right now, mergansers. Pretty good for raptors. You can pretty reliably find raptors. About halfway along the trail, there's a marsh that usually has 40 sandhill cranes or so in it this time of year. So that's a nice place to bird watch. That's the only part of the property that is kind of open for self-guided tours. We have a lot of issues when people are allowed into other parts of the property with them digging up rare plants and taking them home with them. We no longer have lady slippers or many of the orchids that used to be able to be found in some of our wooded areas, in large part because of trespassers and plant poachers. So we keep a pretty tight lid on everything else at the moment. But I try and have, when Cedar Creek is open, I always say 2 to 4, but nowadays it's more like 4 to 8 public events a month that either have a tour or a lecture or a field trip to somewhere on the property. And those all get listed on our upcoming events page, which I will also type in here. Currently, it's very sad. We only have our book club and our monthly Lunch with a Scientist lecture series, because that's all we can do virtually. But there will be other things listed on there when we're back up and running, hopefully before too long. Excellent. That's all the questions that I see. I will put my email down in the chat as well in case other questions come up or people want Cedar Creek specific resources down the road. I'm happy for folks to email me and I will try and get back to you in a timely manner. I will let Joe or Eva or another plant person give some suggestions about planting diverse yards, and then I will, I'll stop talking, let someone else talk.
I just in the chat there, I threw something from the Board of Water and Soil Resources on plant selection. You should be able to see that in the chat now.
That's awesome, Eric. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a suggestion for plant What I did was I went to my local little park, Frost Lake Park, and I luckily the book Trees and Shrubs of Minnesota had come out, the side being very wooded. So I could identify them. I would take pictures, and then I still do this and put them on my laptop and study them, use various resources to figure out what is already here in the remaining natural areas. And then that's in part what I planted in my yard. And red elder grows great. and the other plants that I put in that I see already doing well, or at least surviving. So that's a place to start.
And like Eva just put in the chat there, there's the new book that Wild Ones put out, the Attracting Birds to Your Garden. It has great plant suggestions in there and information on how to choose some of those. So definitely contact Eva about picking up a copy of that booklet.
I'll make sure that all of the links that appear in the chat will also be on our website.
So Joe and I converted our front yard, and many of you know that story. And I will say it wasn't with a lot of deep understanding. When I went to Prairie Resto to pick out seeds, I said, well, we need some of these and we need some flowers. So we are now in what year? Our first year we just planted oats, just to grow out the weeds as much as we could and things like that. That was entertaining because that's when we grew the 10-point buck. But that went away. But we whacked out the oats, and so it was in the fall that we did our seeding. And so we have a lot of grasses, and I just kind of did
it's gotta be that one woman.
With the glasses, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know why she.
But and then just did kind of a swath of more of the flowering plants, but ours is more dominated with the grasses at this point. But you know, that's what plant sales are for, is to add that, oh gee, I wish I'd put that in. And you know, so I'm really sad we're not having our plant sale this year, because I had a little list going. What can I say, Cindy? We could reconsider that. But ours is growing great. The neighbors are, I quickly put out our little signs that talk about that it's a pollinator yard and that it's a bee-friendly yard, because our neighbors across the street have their house for sale, for one thing. And it just educates people quickly, if they don't know us, that we can just explain, this is what our hopes are and this is what our dream is for this space. And mostly we've got some new neighbors and they're just going, oh, that's great. And they're excited. And so summer's coming on and spring is here and I'm happy. That's all I got.
I think that that you've given me the opportunity to say, join us, join our chapter and learn from, or if you're not able to do that, look at our website for the resources that we have there. Joe's put up a great array of starting points to learn about what plants grow in our community, resources we have, books that are good, other websites that are good, but there's a lot to learn. Diversity is complex, biodiversity is, and we learn our yard, and through time we see what grows, but it's nice to have that starting point of understanding what kind of soil you have if you are in the Nokosan Plain, or if you're in the land of clay like I am. There are plants that will do better. And then also understanding your neighborhood. I think that Carol makes a good point that we need to explain to our neighbors what we're doing. And I think that we should maybe put up a sign in our yard that says biodiversity matters. I hear my neighbors complain a lot about, you know, I don't know, fungus in their grass or something. And I'm like, hey, if it wasn't a monoculture like my yard, guess what? You wouldn't have that complaint. But there's a lot to learn, but you can start anywhere. You know, one plant is a good start, but if you get up to 9 and 16 different varieties, then we know that that's good for our yard and good for the wildlife around us. And we just know that biodiversity really matters. So let's keep doing what we're doing. Plant more native plants.
Amen to that. You should be at the end of every biodiversity talk, Eva.
Ah!
You're the perfect, like, here's the little tagline.
Here it is. Well, our tagline, we often say, is restoring the earth 1 yard at a time. And we really are, because each yard links to that whole And all of our wildlife needs, you know, not just one yard to have a snack from, but a lot of yards. And they don't need, you know, McDonald's. They need the real food that we're providing with the native plants that they've evolved with. And then I did think I wanted to point out who Eric was. Eric, you're looking kind of shadowy. Eric Bay is our vice president. I didn't go through who our board members are.
In campfire mode.
And he's in campfire mode, but he is our connection to having Caitlin come and speak to us today, and that's terrific. And of course, now he's moving around, but that's okay. Are there any other questions or concerns that people have tonight?
I just have one more comment. I have adopted all the kids in the neighborhood. And as soon as I put out our pollinator sign in our front yard, and these are little kids that come trailing along, and last summer I just had a ball with these kids, you know, especially the one who said, oh, now that one is red and white and black. Oh, that must be a monarch. And then she saw the caterpillar and she said, oh, and that one will become one. And so the little kids are out now doing their little walking around in the neighborhood. And this kid stops in front of the sign and he says, oh, when are we going to do those again? And he was all excited. And I'm going, you know, sometimes it's hard to teach the adults, but we can always have an audience with those kids. So don't ignore the kids. Yeah.
Good point. Well, I just would like to thank Dr. Caitlin Potter. I forgot to give you your whole name, not just Caitlin.
And just Caitlin, it's okay.
And Borelli, Caitlin Borelli Potter. But I'm so thrilled that you guys were able to join us tonight. It's really fun to see your faces. It's fun when we're in person, but that's not how it is right now. But to be together in this weird time is special. And I just so glad that we were able to connect in this way. Thank you so much to Joe Crow, our webmaster.
Can we give Caitlin a hand for her talk?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask what the etiquette is on Zoom. Do we thumbs up? Do we clap? Go.
I
personal.
love it all.
Yeah.
Usually it's just this awkward, oh, look, people know how to use the reactions.
Oh, I forgot about my little thing.
Usually you just say, okay, and now I'm going to go. And it's very awkward. So thank you. Thank you, Cynthia.
Yay. That's the etiquette. That's the little button. But
Yeah.
we can be old fashioned. Well, we will have a plant sale. I just want to say to Carol, we're planning on it. We're planning on September. We're hoping. And if that doesn't work out, next year. And in the meantime, Twin Cities Wild Ones is having a plant sale. So you can go to their website. And anything else that I should mention before we head out? Shake your heads, yes, no. Eric says no, we're good. Thumbs up to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a great month, and I hope you get a chance to be out in nature. Take care.
Thanks, Eva.
Happy Earth Day, everyone.
Happy Earth
Keep up
Day.
the great work.
Take care.
Great to see you, Caitlin.
Great to